Education seems particularly taken by fads. And so, there's stuff going on, discussion going on, often American discourse around certain issues. And education seems to take it up. And you first see the take up in the United States. And then we have a habit in Canada of just sort of importing whatever those policies are in the United States, importing them into Canada.
This is Viewpoints, a deeper look into the ideas that shape our politics and culture. Break free from the orthodoxies of mainstream media and hear diverse perspectives from interesting people across the political spectrum. You'd think that educational policy would be a pretty dry, technical matter, but these days with political polarization and the culture wars raging, education is anything but. It is seen by many, on the left and the right, as a battleground for different visions of what our society should be. What often gets lost in the politics of education, though, are the students. Are they getting what they need to live productive, fulfilling lives? Is our current educational system fit for purpose? With me today to talk about these questions is Steven Reich. Steven is working on his PhD in educational policy at U of T in the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, which we'll just say OISE from now on. Steven, welcome to Viewpoints.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Your path to educational policy research was not a straight one. You returned to university after 20 years working as a lawyer. Why the late career change and why study education?
Well, that's a natural question. While I did enjoy my legal career, and mostly I engaged in legal research for the purposes of litigation, so I was kind of a backroom guy. I wrote the court briefs and met with clients, and I was sort of the explainer in chief. And while I enjoyed it, I could see that this role was slowly going to fade out, that really it was something for older lawyers who didn't have the computer skills and the research skills in today's world. And I was part of a research lawyers network. And the general message was AI is taking over. The younger people do have some fluency with the computer systems and research. And really, it was time for a change. And to be honest with you, it was really watching my son go through schooling that got me really interested in education. I've always been interested in learning. I love learning. I love learning new things. I've always been interested in how we learn. I was previously a professional actor, so things like how do you learn your lines? How do you, those are all things that I thought a lot about in terms of, well, how do I do that? In terms of music, I'm a singer, I'm a choral director. How do I teach people their parts? And particularly I lead one choir that's amateurs. So here are people, some of whom don't read music. How do I teach them? How do I make sure that what I want gets stuck in their brains so that they reproduce it? And how do we get to the point where this is performable, where someone would say, wow, that sounds professional, even though everybody singing is an amateur? So that's kind of where my interest came from. And I thought it was during COVID, and I thought, now maybe would be a good time. I'm sort of in a place in life where I can manage to do this financially, in terms of time. My kid's grown up. So I should do it. I'm interested in education. I'm really disappointed in what I saw in my son's education and speaking with other people. Maybe I can make a difference. Maybe I need to do some research to find out what's out there, what's going on, and that I'll learn something that will allow me to then help further the discussion, a societal discussion I think that we need to have about the purpose of education and how best to do it in the fairest way possible.
So it wasn't really like for you a political thing. It was more like a curiosity about learning and how do you make improvements in these systems kind of thing.
Absolutely. I stay far away from saying I'm, right, I'm center, I'm left. I mean, it depends on the policy. So, you tell me the policy, let's discuss how realistic it is, whether or not we can implement it, what the unintended consequences are, and then I'll take a position. And then if I hear further evidence, I might change my position. So, I don't fit in anywhere on that political spectrum. I understand that people want to cling to their tribe in terms of, politics, but that's not me. And maybe that allows me to speak to the full spectrum of political opinions.
Interesting. And so when you got into university and you started researching like educational policy and theory, how do you think like that connects up with what gets taught in schools, and what's the connection there?
So it's complicated, and at the same time, it's quite simple. You have the same group of people that is doing the research into education, and these are the kind of people that are then recruited to staff the Ministry of Education. They're also the people that are writing in the journals that are influencing the people that are staffing the ministry. They also tend to be the people who are at least the colleagues, if not the actual professors, in the teacher preparation programs. So if you go and you do an advanced degree, you get your PhD in education, then you may be then teaching future teachers about education. And some of your colleagues are going to then be going to the ministry. Other colleagues may then go to the boards.
Okay.
So it's really a single system, but there's lots of feedback. So you've got feedback from the teachers themselves, to the principals, to the ministry, to the boards, plus you've got from the top down from the universities into the faculties of education that prepare the teachers, as well as into the actual ministry.
Can you give me an example of how, say, a policy ends up in the classroom in like a K-12 school?
Well, if I think about, let's take something broad. So, the current, and I say current, but, now there is some political pushback toward it. Diversity, equity, inclusion. Let's just talk about that, for example. But we could use any policy. Bullying, lately, within the last 5 years, the ministry came out with an anti-human trafficking policy, which one might say, what is that doing in education? That seems like a criminal matter. But I think that what I see, and I'm not the only one, is that education seems particularly taken by fads. And so, there's stuff going on, discussion going on, often American discourse around certain issues, and education seems to take it up. And you first see the take up in the United States. And then we have a habit in Canada of just sort of importing whatever those policies are in the United States, importing them into Canada. And by policies, I mean both at the academic levels, so that you have Canadian scholars that are basically just lifting American research and then talking about Canada as if it is already the 51st state. So that's one. That's been going on for a long time. And then you also see, in terms of the ministry, that the ministry starts putting stuff into its curricula, into its policy documents that are lifted straight from fads in the United States.
Okay.
The thing is that some fads last longer than others, and some fads actually have some traction. And what I would call critical theory, which is where the equity, diversity, and inclusion comes from. I mean, they sound like lovely words, but they actually have a theoretical base, and they mean something that is not what most people think of when they think of equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Sure.
And we can talk about that, but that is lifted straight out of American academia, American policy, placed in Canadian schools without any contextual, revision. And that one is really stuck. And that one is really stuck because it really feeds into this whole idea in progressivism, which is, the idea that everything should be child-centered, catering to the child's desires and needs. It has a very romantic view of childhood and child learning. So that's number one. So it makes it quite popular. I mean, who doesn't want to center their child? So that's number one. And it also has this sort of veneer of the civil rights movement, right? The good things that came out of the civil rights movement. Some would call it, the perfecting, as Martin Luther King Jr. called it, the perfecting of classical liberalism.
Sure.
The inclusion of people who were previously excluded from what liberalism has to offer. But that's not what equity, diversity, and inclusion is.
As it's rolling out in these institutions, yeah.
Well, and in its basis, it actually
theoretical.
It actually comes from a whole other tradition, which is not the civil rights movement, but what was going on at the time in the United States, which was sort of the separation movement. like the black separation movement. There was a feminist separation movement saying, this is a white patriarchal society. We will never fit in. We must construct our own society and be in opposition to this. That's where equity, diversity, inclusion comes from, not from Martin Luther King Jr.'s, dreams of a colorblind society where people are judged on merit and their character, but rather this sort of separatist movement that's almost revolutionary. And I think that that's another part of its appeal. We're going to man the barricades. We're going to have a revolution. It's very exciting when you actually are not living in a war zone and when you have creature comforts that you're not really worried about in terms of losing them.
And even something, I guess, less political would be, I know that they had this different way of thinking about learning how to read for a while, where, in the old days, people learned phonetics and they learned how to read. And then somehow, somewhere along the way, someone proposed that it was better to use this, whole word learning or something?
Right.
Is that part of the same kind of process we're talking about?
Yes. Because again, and this is connected to both things. I mean, first of all, the revolutionary movement, this idea that, we have to demolish things, we have to deconstruct, we have to dismantle. It looks at all of what used to be orthodoxies and says, just smash it all, throw out the baby with the bathwater. So if, there's some bad outcomes from it, then let's just get rid of it all. It's not really interested in science because, they say, well, everyone has their own narrative. Everyone has their own path to truth. Everyone has their own truth. There is no actual truth that we should, try to discover. And plus, it's married with that progressivism, the idea, it's the child's interest. Every child is unique and different. So, for example, for at least 100 years or more, people were taught to read, and generally people were taught to read fluently. There were very few people who were unable to read or, would today be diagnosed with dyslexia because it was, the 3 R's. And, teachers had a kind of script to go through to say, we have to learn the letters, we have to match the letters to their sounds, we have to then blend them with other sounds. While we're doing that, we have to learn the rules of spelling. There's because English is an amalgam of both Germanic and Latin languages, we have to learn the basis. We should learn Latin so that we're able to, see which words come from Latin, maybe Greek, which a lot of, the Greek words are what populated the German language, which then populated the English language, and that many of our spelling rules follow that. So that it's not just sort of, English spelling is willy-nilly, but rather there is an internal logic to it. So, there was this idea that all children have to learn these things. And I think that to the progressives, it sounded boring. Do
you think that's a progressive thing? I just want to get it clear on this because I thought the whole word learning thing. Can you first of all describe a little bit what the alternate approach would be to to learning how to read?
Sure. So, the whole language, well, there's a bunch of different names. And of course, in academia, then people start, fiddling with the fabric, and then suddenly it becomes something else. But whole language, balanced literacy, the cueing system, these are all ways where we say to children, it's part of this paradigm where we say children will discover their own learning. That's deeper learning. So in all of those, what we're asking children to do is to discover how to read. Right. So the 3 cueing system, which was in place in Ontario and which many teachers probably are still using, although in 2022, the Ontario Human Rights Commission actually came out with a report and said, stop doing that. And there should be a wholesale revision. We're failing our students. But, the ministry didn't exactly respond, in a strict way to say, no, that's out. Absolutely. No more discovery learning. This is, the script that teachers should be using. Here's the textbooks and workbooks that teachers should be using. But basically it was like guess. So to give you an example, you would have a picture and you would say to a student, okay, well, write a story about the picture. So this student hasn't learned any spelling, may not know all the correspondences. There's a middle class assumption there that their parents have taught them that, which is an unfair assumption, which of course only benefits the middle class and the upper class. It doesn't benefit those students that maybe didn't come from a home where parents were able to do that with their children. Mm-hmm. And then you might see something where, a kid just writes the word blah, B-L-A. Now, they don't mean blah, they mean play. So, but they haven't had instruction to differentiate between the two plosives, b and p. They know the L sound and they know the letter A as the start of the alphabet. So play is blah. You very quickly get exhausted because you're using your working memory. And this is where sort of the cognitive science comes in.
Okay.
You're using your working memory, which has very limited capacity, to try and figure out, how am I going to say what I'm going to say? That's if a kid has enough motivation to do it. Maybe they want to please the teacher. Mm-hmm. There's lots of kids who just give up, right? I don't know how to spell it. I don't know how to write down what I want to say. And the same with reading. So in whole language or balanced literacy, you'd walk into a classroom, there'd be a big, shelf of books, and they'd have different colors to them. Like, green would be beginners, yellow would be intermediate, et cetera, et cetera. And the teacher will say, just pick a book that interests you and try and read it. Like try, from the pictures and from what you know of the sounds.
So you're expected to guess basically. So this word is probably the word I'm thinking it is.
Right.
And so I'm going to say that word, even though I'm not sure it's that word.
Right.
Precise. Okay.
So to give you an example, Sean, I know you don't read Sanskrit, but if I gave you a document in Sanskrit with a picture and said, okay, read this, you can imagine how frustrated you'd get pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And now imagine yourself as a 6-year-old with limited understanding of the world. You don't really understand, why do I need to learn how to read, right? You've been served very well for the last 5-6 years without reading. Why do I need to learn to read? Well, this is very effortful and I can't do it. So you can imagine the number of kids that just throw up their hands.
Wow.
So in a
and
system
it's actually
where
affected it, the number of people who kind of come out of the system with really bad reading skills has gone up, right?
Yes. So astronomically. And we've labeled them as having disabilities. So now we have around 30% of Ontario students with, so-called learning disabilities. And I'm not saying, there are some disabilities, absolutely, but that's too high. You wouldn't expect to see that. Historically, you don't see that.
Okay.
You don't see that in other jurisdictions where they do have, a science-based method of teaching children how to read. We never used to have that. So you have to ask yourself, okay, well, maybe these are teacher-created disabilities. And maybe a lot of those kids, and then they have a ready solution. And the solution is, well, we'll just give you talk to text. Now we have, we're infatuated with technology. Maybe you don't have to read. Maybe you can just have the text said to you.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't have to ever write or spell. You can just talk into a microphone and it'll spell it out for you. And that's been the solution. I mean, the other solution has been to basically outsource it to parents. So because parents aren't trained in how to teach children to read, I mean, they may have some, sense of how to do it, which is probably the same sense that most teachers have. But as the Ontario Human Rights Commission report says, people, adults do not, just because they read, know how to teach children how to read. And a lot of what they think they know is because they're so acclimatized to it that they don't actually understand the individual parts that have to go into the mix of teaching children how to read.
So looping back to my first question, which was kind of how does policy affect the stuff that gets taught? That is, there's a clear case where somewhere along the way they decided that this was a better way to learn how to read, and they pushed it out through the schools and the teacher curriculum. Is that how it works?
Yes. And you have multiple, forces all at once. So number one, let's talk about the ministry. So up until 2023, when the ministry came out with its new elementary school language curriculum, they fronted inquiry-based learning and the cueing system. Look at the picture, look at the surrounding words, take guesses. this was our provincial curriculum, supposedly written by experts. Now, what's interesting is in 2003, and we had already been using this sort of method of teaching reading probably since the late 80s or early 90s.
Wow, so that's like generations of kids who went through this. Yeah.
And we can talk about that generation of kids who don't read. But, the ministry actually was concerned by the results of, what they were seeing and commissioned an expert panel to talk about it. And they said reading has to be taught directly with the teacher having a script, using phonics, then moving on, using spelling, comprehension. Comprehension has to be attached to something of interest. So therefore, the content of what you're doing, it's not just I can throw any piece of text in front of you and it's good enough. No, I need to have, something that's rich and interesting that's going to grab the kids. And then we use that to work on vocabulary, not just a list of, random vocabulary words, for example. Yeah. And the province ignored it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They made no change whatsoever. The Ontario Human Rights Commission in their 2022 report actually states that straight out. You had almost 20 years ago an expert panel telling you that what you're doing is not working and you didn't make any changes.
Wow.
And at the same time, what do you think they're doing in faculties of education? They're saying no to cognitive science. I mean, if you look at the courses that are available for teachers or, those that intend to become teachers, you might see 1 or 2 courses in cognitive science, but a lot of them are highly political. And they're really about the critical theory of education and how do we dismantle our systems of oppression as if that's going to teach children how to read.
Okay.
But the ideologues really believe that children are naturally motivated towards social justice, which remains pretty undefined, right? Because I'm not sure what social justice means. I mean, as a lawyer, I can tell you that even the word justice is kind of a slippery word.
Yeah.
Justice to one is not justice to another. If you're on the losing side of a case, you don't feel that you got justice. Justice is a process. It's a system of processes that's supposed to get you to a certain outcome. So then you have to ask yourself, okay, well then what is social justice? What are the processes that are supposed to get us to some area where people are no longer marginalized, where they can escape their circumstances? Well, if that's social justice, then why aren't we using cognitive science-based methods to teach children? Because those have been tested over and over decades and have shown that they improve the academic achievement of all students, including those students whose first language is in English, who come from poorly resourced families, who can't afford tutors, whose parents maybe, are working 3 jobs, that they don't have time to sit with their kids and teach them or help them with homework. So we know there's actually a system that delivers what I'm saying social justice is. But that's not what social justice means when the social justice people talk about it.
Okay. And the history of cognitive science-based learning really is kind of like the history of just basic learning, right? I mean, it's been labeled cognitive science-based learning. Is that different from just like good old learning they used to do in the early 20th century or
it's
19th century?
Education became professionalized. So prior to that, you would have, it was mostly women who were teachers. And they might, at first they were just the ones who could read and write and do a little bit of math. And, they kind of taught by the seat of their pants. But cognitive science, like the natural inclination to say, I'm the expert, I know what I'm doing, I'm going to teach it to you, you're going to have to kind of memorize what I'm teaching you and feed it back to me, and I'm going to have to continually test you to make sure you have the understanding and you're recalling it. That natural impulse proved to be correct, because then when education became professionalized and it became an academic pursuit and cognitive scientists actually began conducting experiments to see, how do people learn?
How far does that go back?
That goes back to, I'm not 100% sure, but at least the 1950s.
Okay.
and they would do, experiments. And they found that actually that inclination of what I was just talking about was actually true. And then the science takes off and says, okay, well, how can we refine that? Like, how do we make that into a model that we can give to people and say, you're a teacher. If you follow this model, this is going to work for, I believe the Ontario Human Rights Commission said, in terms of reading, 95 to 98% of students.
Wow.
Right? So if we can get to a point where only 5% or 2% of students are having difficulty reading and may never read, that those are the ones that we may have to use technology so that they can communicate with the outside world. Well, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And we're not there in Ontario. Like the Human Rights Commission said that of Canada's labor force, 40% are functionally illiterate.
Wow.
So that's scary. And then, we come back to, what we just talked about, the children from the 90s who were in school in the 90s, and then in this century, not enjoying reading. Well, sure. The advent of technology and the phone and whatever is maybe part of it. But even on the phone, older adults use the phone and will read long articles. I know I do.
Yeah.
And I will subscribe to things so that I can read a 15-minute, a 20-minute article. So I don't think that's exactly the reason why. I think the reason why is it's too effortful. And I often ask, because I'm always interested in young people, like, so what are you learning? How are you learning it? Do you like it? Do you like reading? What are you reading? And the response that I mostly get is that, no, I don't read for pleasure. And I don't like reading. It's too hard.
Okay.
So it's too hard because they never learned how to read. And even for the ones that are now teenagers or even adults, like it may actually be useful to go back to the beginning building blocks of reading and to learn phonics and to learn how to read to automaticity. That's where we want to get to.
Yeah.
That you're not even conscious. You're expending no cognitive effort in reading whatsoever.
Yeah.
As soon as you're expending cognitive effort in trying to make out what am I reading, right? That's taking up all the energy from what does it mean?
Yeah.
How does it relate to the last sentence I read? How does this connect with my previous knowledge, with ideas that I had before? That's what your working memory is for. It's for application in new situations. If you're using your working memory just to read out a sentence, there's no room for you to do any thinking, critical or otherwise.
And this isn't just for reading. Obviously, cognitive science-based learning applies to most subjects, right?
Absolutely. And you'll see, and anyone who has children who are in the school system, and that includes even most private schools as well, because, the private schools are mostly doing what the public schools are doing, particularly in Ontario. They're just doing it for more money and with fancier equipment. But if you actually look, and I actually participated in doing research into what private schools in Ontario are offering, and the vast majority of them are just offering the Ontario curriculum.
Okay.
Or variations on it. And most of them are child-centered and inquiry-based. So that's the progressivism that I was talking about earlier. So, how does it affect it? So what parents will see is my kid has a lot of projects. So, they've never learned anything about the carbon cycle. They've never learned anything about meteorology, climatology. They've never learned anything about the history of the earth. They've never learned anything about, what happens when you burn oil and what comes out of that, the chemical compositions, and they're asked to do a project on the climate emergency, right? So, what happens? The very motivated students will go to, well, now they'll use AI, but previously it was Wikipedia. And to be honest, I saw my son do this, and eventually, the ones who are, just want to get the project done will figure it out pretty quickly. I go to the subject, I find the Wikipedia article, I copy it into slides because now, everything is a slideshow that you're then supposed to read from. and we can talk about that as well. But, I copy it into slides. I reword it. I go to Google Images and I pick a few images and populate it. If I'm really motivated, I might even add some music to each slide. I copy the references in the Wikipedia article and then run them through the computer, so that either they're in the Chicago style or APA 7, which the teachers want. And their project's done. I get an A.
Okay.
And you'll just have one series after another of projects. But even if they're not that simple, to ask kids, pick a country in the world and discuss, how people are marginalized in that country because of patriarchy or whatever. So now you're asking kids who have very little geographic knowledge, because believe me, nobody is filling in maps anymore and having to memorize, countries of the world or regions of the world and what goes on there, and learn some history about the people and the culture, So, they have no idea of geography. They don't know anything about this country. They don't know anything about its history. And now you're asking kids to just learn on their own. I mean, if this project-based learning, which comes out of inquiry-based, whole language, whole child, progressive. I mean, basically, it's saying to teachers, you're superfluous, like you're just the marker, or the babysitter, right? The teaching should be what you do. Why are children teaching themselves, right? The goal is that you want to teach them enough to age 18 so that then they can engage in their own learning. But it's your job to give them enough background across the board in everything, right? In the sciences, in math, in history, in geography.
So are we talking just rote knowledge here, not just like the critical thinking skills and the research skills to look it up for themselves, but actually just sort of rote?
Well, people throw that out as and I know, rote has a bad name to it.
Yeah.
Which is unfair, because rote learning is important, right? You can't learn your multiplication tables without rote learning. You got to do it, right? You can't learn your phonics without rote learning. And you need those skills established very early, right? And we're very lucky, because young children who, they don't have the ability to critically think about things because they don't know very much. And, their frontal lobe hasn't, the frontal lobe finally hits, its peak development at 25. So, to ask a 6-year-old to critically think about something, you're basically asking them just to parrot whatever you said or whatever someone else said. That's a perfect time. The kids are really concrete. They love learning rhymes. They love learning songs, dance routines. That's when you do your rote learning, right? But even later on, like, you have to have some sense of history and understand it. And in order to learn that, right, you are going to have to do some rote learning. When I was an actor and I'd have to learn lines, or as a singer and I have to learn a song, I have to rote learn it.
Yeah.
Right? So that I'm not struggling during my performance. I'm more worried about my emotion. I'm more worried about what I'm conveying, the story that I'm conveying through the play or through the music, than I am about the individual notes or the lyrics to the song or the words that a playwright has given me. So rote learning is important throughout your life.
And that's sort of an essential part of, in a way, of a cognitive science-based approach, right? Is that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, people talk about critical thinking skills. The big thing now is like, we don't want to teach, we don't need to do that because there's Google. We're going to teach critical thinking skills. The fact is, like, if I asked you to critically think about the Sanskrit script, you would have nothing important to tell me because you don't know anything about it. You can't critically think about something you have no knowledge about. You have to be an expert in it.
Yeah.
Right? So to ask a kid in grade 3, right, to critically think about climate change, what do they know about it? Right? Do they understand all the systems that go into, creating a phenomenon and how we understand it? No, of course not. So what are they doing? They're just, parroting whatever the teacher says or whatever their parents say. The poor parents who have to sit with their kids, while they're screaming and yelling, doing homework. I mean, the Ontario Human Rights Commission also found in surveying parents, 51% of parents are sick and tired of, having their family life ruined by these projects and the homework that they have to sit and do with their kids. And they feel really put out because they're not the experts and they're working and they're raising kids. Like, let them have family time, right? This is what should be going on in school. Okay, so critical thinking, you have to be able to understand an area, right? So if you're going to critically think about something historical, okay, so let's say you're going to critically think about Canada as a nation, right? You better know your history, right? And that history is full, and that history can go back pre-contact. So that can go back to, okay, well, who, as early as we can tell, because the First Nations in North America did not, well, at least in Canada, did not have writing systems, right? So, I mean, that's what helps archaeology reconstruct previous cultures in other parts of the world. So we don't have that, but we do have some archaeology. There is some storytelling. Now, again, you know, one person's story is a story. It may be true or not. You know, I can ask, you know, a wise relative about something that happened. They'll tell me a story. It may not actually reflect the truth. It's their, you know, how they've reconstructed what happened in their own memory. But if you have enough stories that are the same, then you can start saying, okay, this is evidence of something that happened. So to learn about, okay, who are the first peoples that were here in Canada? And what were they doing? And did they trade with each other? Did they war with each other? What was their culture? What was their language like? What did they, you know, how did they survive our harsh climate? And then move on to, you know, the Europeans coming over. You know, it wasn't immediately, I think that a lot of people are under the impression that, you know, people came and they just kicked, you know, First Nations off their land and whatever. And not to say that that didn't happen in certain circumstances, but when you read the history of Canada and you realize, like, there were alliances and there was trade, and for the first few hundred years there were no settlements in Canada.
So it's a lot more complicated and nuanced in the history in order to understand that and have any kind of sense of being able to reflect critically on it.
That's right.
You just have to know that stuff.
And the other problem is that when you don't have mastery over a subject such as history, for example, like why is Canada constituted the way it is? You know, the British, the French, I mean, you have to understand all of that, right? And then the history, including the mistakes that were made, right? But the problem now is that when you don't have any mastery over that, then what you do is something called presentism, that you judge everything from your location right here and your moral authority to pronounce judgment on people that lived 100 years ago, 200 years ago, etc., and assume that they knew everything that you knew, right? You know, there's 200, 300 years of history and the growth in human knowledge and the growth in, you know, what the world has given us in terms of thinking, and that people 100 years ago didn't have. So it's not very critical to think about what happened in the past by judging it by the present. It's much more critical to judge what happened in the past by what other narratives, what other political conversations were happening in the past. You know, was there a different path that someone could have taken? You know, what was the advice that was going around at that time? What were people saying? Now, that's critical thinking, right?
Yeah.
To piece that all together.
Yeah.
But can you do it without knowing the whole history? Yeah. So why don't we take the time to teach children the content, right? And that goes for literature. Like when you hear, you know, kids say, like high school students, so, you know, we didn't do really any Shakespeare, and that's okay because I don't like Shakespeare and whatever. Well, you haven't been exposed to Shakespeare, right? You haven't really learned Shakespeare. You haven't dived into it. You know, in many ways, you know, the curriculum, for example, that we have in Ontario for every subject, you know, it can be like 200 pages long, 300 pages long. It's too broad. Let's narrow it down. You know, let's narrow it down to its essentials. And I mean, listen, that gets to the question of what is the purpose of education? And maybe we have to have a straight answer to that before we proceed, because, you know, the critical theorists would say the purpose of education is to wake people up so that they overthrow systems of oppression. That's what they would say. Okay.
So now let's spend a little bit of time on this. So we've established that cognitive science-based learning works. It's been proven to work. There's a lot of studies to show it. And it's also just like, we just know it works because it's it worked for decades and decades and decades.
Right.
And so now along comes like a different way of looking at things. What do you think? I think you did an MA thesis on this where you trace the history of some of the alternate learning theories. And I think it goes back to like the 60s, is that kind of time frame, right?
Well, the sort of underpinnings of the social justice movement go back even further. It's a real mix of this, that, and the other thing in the kitchen sink.
Yeah.
But the original critical theorists were like the neo-Marxists who were trying to understand why communism didn't take hold in Europe, why it took hold in Russia, and why it was such a disaster, resulting in tens of millions of deaths. Mm-hmm. And they were also, Freud was new at that time. The whole idea of there being a subconscious was very appealing, and Marx had sort of written about, consciousness and whether or not workers are, take on the consciousness of the owners of production. So, we can start there with the critics of society, but then it's a mix, then you have the deconstructionists and the postmodernists from France in the 50s and 60s and 70s. You've got Rousseau and this whole idea of, that civilization is evil and that, if we only lived in nature, that we would be these perfect beings that would act morally and do social justice. And so it's like a conglomeration. Then, and of course, we have the late 60s, the civil rights movement versus sort of the separatist movements. The explosion at universities, the riots, whatever, from the confining 1950s to sort of break free, the me generation. Like you can see how this all together.
Yeah, it's sort of like a melange of a bunch of different things, right?
That's right. But you'll notice that they're all fads. Like it's not that someone came up with something and then they rigorously wanted to test it with children to see whether or not this works. Is this better? Is it going to be a better society if we teach children this way or that way? It wasn't. It was all about fads. So then, when it became the me generation, then that became a fad, right? So what did schools do? They tore out the walls inside. Oh, we're going to have an open space where people can wander and learn. Well, it didn't take long for, the noise level to convince people to put the walls back up. We used to line up the desks in rows facing the teacher. That seemed natural, right? We want everyone's focus to be on the teacher. That's also part of cognitive science, right? Children have limited attention.
Yeah. I have limited attention.
Well, and it's interesting because attention, look, we do come into the world wired in certain ways. Like I'm not a blank slatist that believes that, our bodies are just sort of the traveling mechanism for our heads. We are wired in certain ways and we're different and we come with different talents, and some people have no talent and some people have issues that will be issues for their whole life that are going to challenge them. But what we want to get to is we want to get to at least a level of fluency. So, with many of these fads, they were not tested. They were just adopted and they sounded great, right? Like, so in an era where we say, the 50s was confining, it was authority, everyone had to act the same, it erased individuality. Well, okay, well, now we're free of that. We've thrown that off. We're now free. It's all about individuality. And then, so that becomes a fad. So then in education, we have to teach every student according to their learning styles. Whatever. Someone made up learning styles. There's no evidence behind it.
Okay, so they didn't do research. Some person basically did speculative writing on a subject, and then it became somehow
it became doctrine. I mean, now if you said to most teachers, that learning styles don't exist. Like cognitive science has tested them. People say, I'm a kinesthetic learner, for example. I can only learn when I'm moving and using my hands or whatever. And then they've tested that. They've taught them like that way and then taught them a different way and then found that, it didn't really make a difference. That the fact is that we use all of our senses.
So that's something, I didn't know that. Like, I mean, that seems, I probably imbibed that by osmosis from the culture around this learning styles idea, right?
Sure. Like people say, I'm an auditory learner or whatever. Well, when you're learning, assuming that you don't have, you're not blind or deaf or, you're missing a sense, we learn through all of our senses. And cognitive science has a lot to say about how that works in terms of inputs.
So, I mean, and your MA thesis was in a way could have been seen as controversial in your department because Because even using the term critical theory is almost like a hot button term. Like I remember online in like discussion boards on the National Post and stuff like that, you'd see people talk about critical theory, and then someone would come along and comment right away, critical theory is not in education. It's not in K-12 education. This is really adamant group of people who are saying it's not there, that you guys are making it up. It's kind of like a dog whistle kind of right-wing thing that you're doing by saying it's critical theory. And so what your thesis did was to go back and just kind of look at the maybe you should probably describe it better than I can, but
yeah, well, I mean, the research of my thesis was to look at, it was during COVID. So, everything was shut down. So really it was an online research thing. And luckily I had started and I was saving the documents because midway through working on my thesis, the ministry scrubbed all their old policy documents, but I'd saved them. So I had them. So I had about close to, I think it was about 700 documents, policy documents. So curriculum, teacher, resource documents, and then of course, other documents that have to do with funding or infrastructure, less interesting to me, although somewhat still interesting, from 1982 to 2022. So 40 years worth. And I wanted to see, is it, what you're saying? Like, and I've seen the same thing where people say, oh, no, we're not teaching critical theory in school. That's an academic theory. Children are not being exposed to it. And just so that we're clear, sort of the word that often people will use for critical theory is woke. I prefer not to use it because I think it's politically tainted,
charged,
and it does come from a certain tradition that I respect, in an American Black tradition that was about people realizing the predicament that they were in after the Civil War and during the Jim Crow laws, and I don't like using that word. So I think it's truer to use the word critical theory. So, but just to say that for your listeners, the fact of the matter is what I found was that basically you saw in all their policy documents that the critical theory concepts, all the language that critical theory uses, starts infiltrating very shortly after it starts infiltrating, the educational academic writing in the 1990s. So, there's a little bit of a time lag. And then you see that it starts going up as there are events in the United States. So the Rodney King beating, and then the riots afterward, and then we had the copycat riots on Yonge Street. Well, suddenly there was a boost of, where there was none before, talking about anti-racism and systemic discrimination, systemic oppression. Then you had an American writer talking about how standard education was too white and it wasn't appropriate for Black boys, and that she was going to create a culturally relevant teaching style for young American Black boys that sourced youth culture, but it was also Marxist, right? Because it's part of that. So we're not going to have marks. The kids are going to do their own projects. Everyone gets the same mark. They decide how they want to evaluate each other, et cetera, et cetera. And then we see it drop into Canada. Like suddenly now we're adopting culturally relevant pedagogy.
Like in the 80s and 90s and onwards.
That's right.
Yeah.
In the 90s and then the 2000s. And then after each sort of moral panic that happens, right? So then we have, well, certainly in 2020 with George Floyd.
Yeah, everything just got totally ramped up after that.
Like it was like every moral panic that we had was then adopted and thrown in, all under this sort of rubric of critical theory that, that we can divide society into oppressors and the oppressed, and that, we should take intersectionality. Like there's an example, intersectionality. That was developed because American constitutional law said at the time that, if you want to sue for discrimination, you have to choose one ground. You can't choose more than one ground. So if you were discriminated against because you were Black and you were female, you can only choose one. So intersectionality was this legal idea that no, like, the discrimination that I experienced was because of both of those things, and that they interact with each other on some level. So it was a legal theory, right? How this became an educational theory where we now give grade 1 students an oppression wheel to fill in about, are you white? Are you, what's your race, what's your gender identity, what's your, like, this whole idea of identity in and of itself. I mean, there's an idea that leaked from psychology, right? The idea that humans construct for themselves sort of an identity as part of your ego and your superego, leaked into education to this idea that everyone has to claim an identity, and then your identity is intersectional, and your identity intersects with other identities, and ideally the identity that you want to have is one of oppression or marginalization, because you can't take advantage of certain benefits that are being offered unless you come from that population. So then we decide that suddenly males who are 50% of the population are bad. So then boys are bad, and there's toxic masculinity with no discussion of, well, if there's toxic masculinity, maybe there's toxic femininity. Anyone that is too far to the extreme of either one, you could say, there may be toxic effects, but this becomes an ongoing ideology. Now, imagine yourself, you're a young boy in school, and what you're getting is that, like, somehow being a boy is bad, or that your skin color is bad, or that you're being labeled as white, and I'll give you the example. And I think of my Italian and Greek friends, that they go, white, like, the white or the mangia cake, like they're those guys. I'm not white, I'm Italian, or, I'm Sicilian, or I'm, and I think that most people, I mean, how many people actually identify with belonging to the white race? I mean, other than, the crazy militant white supremacists, I can't think of anyone that defines himself that way. More so now, but certainly, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people didn't in Canada. The United States is a different story.
Yeah.
But we imported that narrative into Canada, right? Like, multiculturalism was all about our cultures.
So I'm seeing like this kind of thing. You mentioned these fads that come through education, and they seem to like accumulate like a kind of a cruft that's in the system of all these different things, and they don't really, I guess, get cleared away, or they're not tested, or that's another thing too I actually wanted to ask you about, because so a lot of these ideas you're talking about, intersectionality, these new ways of teaching kids, they're not really being tested or subjected to like evidence-based analysis, right? Like, no. How well does this work? Is it working? Is it helping students?
It's interesting because cognitive scientists, have tested, like, having a stated identity. I'm this, I identify as blank, 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 blank. Does that help me learn better? And the answer is no. So we know that. Well, a few critical theorists in the United States tried to actually test whether or not using critical pedagogy, like a critical teaching, resulted in better academic achievement. Like, because that was the whole purpose of it, right? It was invented to say, black boys aren't doing well in school. If we, use a culturally relevant pedagogy, they're going to do better.
Yeah.
Then they're going to succeed. So they tested it. And in the United States, they actually do have, some standard that they can measure against, because they do have standardized tests in subject areas where they, states will have them so that they can see, like, do students know history? Do they know math? Do they know algebra, etc.? So what did they find? They found that it had no effect on academic achievement. And they found that it made students more, certain students, particularly the ones who they were being focused on. So if you had a class in the States that was, let's say, a high percentage of African Americans and then some Latino Americans. So it found, like, if the focus was on African Americans, then the African American students felt, that they cared about, they felt motivated, and they were interested in the subject matter because the subject matter was about them. But at the same time, it also made them feel that they didn't belong to society. And and for some of the experiments, they ended up saying, well, I'm not sure what the point is of trying, because if I live in a society that is so against me and I can't ever succeed, then why bother even trying? Now, for the non-identified group in the classroom, so say the Latino American students, it made them angry toward their fellow students. They felt left out. They felt like they were not, prioritized. And it created, conflict, like ethnic conflict. So you look at that and you go, I don't know, like that doesn't seem like, like an advertisement for, let's employ this.
Yeah.
Why would we do that in Canada when we had a nice model called multiculturalism, right? Where we looked at people not in terms of their skin color or their physiognometry, but rather we looked at them in terms of that they may be attached to a culture that is different than just sort of a standard Canadian culture. And we want to encourage them to continue to produce that culture. So speak your language at home, celebrate your holidays, celebrate your food, share it with us, bring it to school. We'd love to hear about your holiday. Bring some food that we can share. Show us your dress. Let's have, cultural festivals. But what did the critical theorists do? I mean, they rained on that parade. Like they said, oh, that's just, that just feeds into the white supremacy and, so it's not really revolution. It's like, no, it's not revolution. It's about people realizing that we're all the same, but we put on different costumes. We might eat slightly different foods or speak, different languages. But, the beauty of multiculturalism is how similar we are and how we can relate to that. The only people that I suppose that lose out from that are the people whose families have been here for multiple generations, whose parents never gave their kids any sense of a culture. And so they just have like Canadian culture.
Yeah. Like I don't speak Danish. My dad came from Denmark. I don't know anything about Denmark really.
There you go. So, so I look at that and I say, well, there we have another problem. I mean, multiculturalism is fine, but we also have to have a unifying Canadian culture that we can all belong to, right? We need something to unify us. Why is anyone going to care about Canada or feel any sense of civic duty or responsibility if they don't have a strong connection and patriotism to Canada? Now, we've spent the last 10 years up until Donald Trump, threatened to make us the 51st state, putting down the idea of Canada. Like if you raised a Canadian flag, you were seen as a fascist. And I know that, when my son was in school, even talking about the idea of, that we should be proud to be Canadian was put down as like you're supporting a genocidal regime and whatever. Like this can't happen. I mean, now we've gone in a different direction. But we need to look like as English Canadians, like, let's look at the French Canadians and how they've maintained their culture and, that you can walk into a bar where someone gets up and sings French folk songs and everyone knows the songs. Okay. And everyone feels a commonality in a sense of whatever to the culture. We need to construct that in Canada and we can. Like we do have the basis.
Yeah,
but that's
a very controversial subject right now because of the politics that are in these in most of our institutions.
Sure. Well, and we don't want to talk about the alternatives. Like, are we constructing a society where we've cleaved off the French? I mean, the whole dream of having a bilingual country went into the trash because education didn't take it seriously. Like there's no reason why after 8 years of being in school and taking French, you should not be fluent in French unless it was taught terribly across the country, which is the case. I mean, I saw the kind of French education.
I had French and I took French for quite a few years. I'm not able to speak it.
Well, I mean, that's a crime, really. Right? Like the education establishment should be ashamed of itself for that, and there's talk about constructing a Canadian identity. Every English Canadian should be able to speak French, at least passable French. I'm not saying that they have to be, fully fluent, but enough to get by that they could go to a French speaking area of Canada and be able to function and order in a restaurant, get directions, pleasantries, etc. Maybe even read a French book, God forbid, in Europe, people learn 2, 3, 4 languages in school. Like you never hear people, they're not ferreting people out and saying, oh, no, your kid can only learn one language. You hear that a lot. Like, teachers saying to parents, oh, I don't think, French immersion is good for your kid. They're struggling. You should put them in the English program.
Okay. I guess I'm just trying to put the pieces together because it sounds like, the cognitive-based learning, it works. We know it works. But for some reason, our educational system has adopted a whole bunch of other, and have those theories supplanted cognitive based learning entirely, or is it just sort of like a mishmash? Or
Well, okay, we have to differentiate between sort of what is official policy and what the universities are doing, and then what an individual teacher is doing in their classroom. But they are connected.
Yeah.
But yet different, because obviously a teacher, can close the classroom door, and the teacher has a lot of autonomy. So, older teachers who are probably now at this point, reaching retirement age, who were educated under, a system that was more about, you got to learn the basics, and you got to learn to read and spell, and literature is important, and, those kind of things. They're probably teaching in a way that if, some of their younger principals knew what they were doing in the classroom, they'd be in trouble. And I have heard stories from teachers, like those teachers don't over decorate their classroom, and they arrange the desk to face the teacher. So the teacher's the focus of the classroom. I mean, those are all cognitive science based givens, and then they're told by the principal, put the desks in flower shapes, and, you need more decoration. Well, without thinking about, well, the decoration might look pretty and might, sort of satisfy your advertising executive's idea of what a child-friendly space looks like. But if the kid can focus on pictures and posters or whatever, then they're not listening, right? That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
They're reading a poster.
Okay.
They're looking at a poster. They're not listening. And even if it's just a picture, if the picture is not supporting what the teacher's doing, then the picture isn't helping you learn.
So they're kind of straying from the official programs,
the older ones.
To do some of this old school teaching.
Sure. And I'm sure that there are some out there that, that are bright and somehow have been exposed to cognitive science who say, I don't think that this is right, or this isn't working, and therefore are doing their own things. But the vast majority of teachers are learning from their faculties that all of the things that I talk about when I talk about, a cognitive science classroom, those things are forbidden. Nothing should be taught directly unless absolutely necessary. That's one of the things in ed school, right? Cognitive science says everything should be taught directly, right? The expert's the one with the knowledge. The novice has no knowledge.
Yeah.
It's your responsibility to transfer your knowledge to the novice and then make sure that the knowledge sticks. Because if you taught something in September and they've forgotten it in June, then you wasted your time, right? So that means you have to revisit it constantly, right? In space time with practice, so that you solidify that information so that the next year you can build on that. Otherwise, you're starting over.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I talked with these about this before, and you're saying that because they're throwing so much at the kids in this way, they're not actually able to glom on to the basics and remember those things to build on them.
Well, and that's why project-based learning is terrible, because you're doing a project on your own, you'll get a mark on it, and that's it. I mean, cognitive, you're going to forget about it. I mean, I used to test this. I used to ask my son, and I used to ask his friends, like, 3 weeks after they did a project, tell me about, whatever the topic was. Pick a building in the world that's historic and whatever. And I'd ask them about it, and they didn't remember anything about it. Well, of course they didn't, because it was just a make work project, right? They're not being tested on it. It's not connected to the history of the place or the culture, or, or even if you were teaching about architecture. So, to a kind of architecture, it's not attached to anything. So it's got, it's gone. But teachers don't realize that. So, they've education departments now, teach teachers, okay, so, that's why you have to spiral the curriculum. You have to return to it the next year and recover the information you've already covered or whatever, because the students don't remember it.
Oh, so they have a term for that.
Yeah. Yeah. They've come up, with coping mechanisms to explain, rather than saying, maybe we've taken a wrong direction. Like maybe we've been hoodwinked, and we've been, by the shiny object over here, these fads from the United States, and, revolution and dismantling and oppression. It all sounds exciting and whatever. And then they've forgotten about what their primary role is. Like their primary role is, the critical theorists will say, and based on there was a Brazilian educator, sort of an educator, Paulo Freire, and he's like a god, and they will say, well, he talked about that we don't want the banking model of education where we put the knowledge into the students. We want the mining, where we mine the knowledge from the students, right, for the purposes of social change and whatever. Well, the students don't have any knowledge because they're too young and they haven't experienced the world. You're the expert.
Okay, so it's like, so for me as an outsider, I'm not part of education, and it's been a long time since I was in K-12, a very, very long time. And I probably finished university before a lot of these trends happened in university. So it's, for me as an outsider, it seems like a bit of a head scratcher. It's hard to make sense of that.
Well, I think that a way that makes it easier to make sense of is you almost have to imagine it as a kind of religion. That this has become like, people are very defensive in education when they're challenged factually about any of the statements that they make about critical theory. So they'll talk about white supremacy or, systemic racism, for example. And I'll say, okay, so in which, and they'll talk about systemic racism in education. So I'll say, okay, so what in education, give me an example of something that is systemically racist, like where the system has adopted something for the purpose of dividing people by race to the detriment of, Black students or Indigenous students or whatever. Mm-hmm. What is it? And they have trouble coming up with it. They keep going to the outcome, right? Well, overall they're not doing as well. So, then you would say, like, if they actually were interested in science, right, you'd say, well, maybe disaggregate that. Like, is it all Black students who are not doing well? Is it different between the girls and the boys? Is it different from different communities? Like, you've taken a bunch of different cultures and you've put them together. What if we, control for socioeconomic level, right? Like, is the student who grew up, in an upper middle class home whose parents came from Nigeria or whatever, are they struggling in school? No, they're not. Like, when you disaggregate, they're not, right? So who are we talking? If we want to solve a problem, first of all, let's find out who we're talking about. And then let's look at all the different reasons why that might be. And let's keep to education. Like, teachers have no qualifications to change the world or to practice psychology or mental health work or whatever. There's some things that are out of their control, right? But what they can do is they can teach. And because the science tells us that all humans learn the same way. So there's, the whole everyone learns differently, the myth, gone. In fact, like, we're realizing that all primates learn the same way. Right. And maybe not just primates. Like, it seems to be that all animals learn the same way. Now, obviously, they have different capacities about how much they can learn. But it seems to be that, like, there's an expert who's the teacher. Like, there's a reason why this developed, right? The society has always developed that way. And I'll hear in classes where someone will say, well, the Indigenous way is different. And I go, is it really? Like, where is that coming from? Like, first of all, which First Nation are you talking about? And I suspect that the person who first, isolates that this is the best way to grow corn, for example, right? That they become the expert and they're the teacher. Like, that they don't go to the person who knows nothing about growing corn and says, okay, well, you discover how to grow corn. Like, they have to feed people. Right? You can't play around, particularly in a climate where, you've got like a growing season of 2 months. Something tells me the person who developed the expertise in growing corn is the person who is in charge of growing corn and the person in charge of teaching the next generation how to grow corn. Right? So this whole idea that Indigenous people learn differently there's no evidence for it.
So there's a lot of these, sacred cows that you're slaughtering right now.
I suppose so. I prefer maybe the metaphor that I'm trying to disabuse people of their myths and their fantasies. And that's why I spoke about it as almost like a religion, because I think that people get, and what I've seen is people get very defensive. How can you say that there's no systemic racism in education, right? I'm not talking about every single system. I'm not talking about all over the world, right? And I'm also talking not about historically, I'm talking about today, right? When someone says, okay, well, what about slavery? I go, no, of course, there's an exact example of systemic racism. I said, but I'm talking about today, right? Like in the early 1970s, women couldn't take out a mortgage or own married women or own their own home, right? But we're not there today, right? There would be an example of patriarchy, right? Rule of the father, right? But give me an example of patriarchy in 2025 in Canada, right? In Canada, where we have rule of the father, where women, we have a system where women cannot escape the rule of their father. Now, that exists in some countries where women can't travel, they can't get medical care without, a guardian, a male guardian giving them permission. That does exist, but not in Canada. And where it does exist in Canada, it's contrary to the law, and it's the kind of situation where Children's Aid is going to get involved, right? So can we not pat ourselves on the back a little bit and say we've become better, that we've fulfilled some of the goals of classical liberalism that were missing in the past, even the recent past? Yes, we can. I think we can do that. And are we making mistakes and bringing back things we got rid of, like quotas, right? Where we used to have quotas at universities. Well, there's a point where affirmative action programs, if they're not well tailored, become a new quota system. Do we want to bring that back?
Yeah.
Like we got rid of quotas because it was racist.
Yeah.
So to reinstall them, and then we have to ask ourselves, and what are the unintended consequences of that? Maybe it would be better, rather than having affirmative action at the university level, is for, the academics of the university to go, okay, what might be missing in a certain population of students in terms of knowledge that they don't have, whether it's knowledge of processes or knowledge of how to go to university, or something as fundamental as reading, and go and do the work there, right? You want to make societal change? Make sure that in grade 1 and grade 2 and grade 3, that all students have mastered reading and writing and arithmetic and whatever. That's going to make a huge difference. So you want to be revolutionary and you want to change the world and have a more fair world where people actually have equal opportunity, go there. You're not going to do it once the kids are 18 or 19 years old.
What you're doing right now is you're working on looking at the ways in which some of these theories are, I think the term you use is operationalized, like how you take a theory like systemic racism or some of these things, and how you would roll that out in a curriculum, and whether or not it's.
So that was more actually in the nature of my my master's.
Oh, it's your master's.
Thesis.
Okay.
What I haven't started research for my PhD yet. I'm still in the coursework part.
Okay.
But what I intend to do is I'm interested to go down a level. So before I was looking at the ministry and what's the ministry doing and promoting in schools, and now I want to know what the teachers' colleges are promoting for schools.
Okay.
And so ultimately, I think I would love to survey teachers finishing up their teacher preparation programs and find out, what are they learning? Are they learning the subject matters that they are going to be teaching? Are they learning how to teach those subjects? And if they are learning how to teach them, are they learning them according to what cognitive science says is how to transfer that knowledge? Or are they getting an ideological and political, critical theory education? And if so, how deep? Are they reading the foundational,
Go read some Foucault and all that.
Right. Are you reading it? You're spouting it, but do you know it? And do you know how you're going to operationalize that in a classroom? Maybe that was the operationalize point. So I'm curious what they're doing, and there haven't been any studies like that in Canada, and understandably so, because no one wants to have the inner workings of their organization sort of looked at. But I think that for the people of goodwill in faculties of education, if they really do care about having a fair system that gives everyone equal opportunity, then they should welcome research like this so that they will be able to turn around and look and go, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Mm-hmm. Can we do it better?
Yeah.
That's where they can have their revolution.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a bit more boring though, maybe a boring revolution.
Well, and it's harder work. It's harder work, right? You have to do experimental research. Like, a lot of research that goes on in faculties of education is, I'm going to talk to one friend or two friends who I already know, and we're going to talk about how we feel about something or how we make sense of, something. Well, it's not generalizable. So, you can't apply it to any situation. It's not really helping. You could take 3 other people and they're going to feel completely differently. So I'm not sure where that research gets us, but that's the research that gets published.
Okay.
There's not that many people doing quantitative research to say, how do we equalize access for students? How do we do this in the most efficient way possible? How do we make sure that students have a broad-based understanding of the most consequential knowledge that has been accumulated over human history? Like, that's the other thing, is that the ideology tends to look at, like, I'm talking about consequential global knowledge, and they're busy like deciding whether it's white or it's black or indigenous or whatever. No, I'm talking about global knowledge, right? Now, certain continents produced more consequential knowledge than others or whatever. So what? In the future, other continents may produce more consequential knowledge. Some of that might be just because of geographical factors. For example, Eurasia, where, the continent of Eurasia is organized, latitudinally, so that someone discovers something in China, it easily gets transferred to India, to Europe, and back and forth. Right. And we know that, like, there's a whole history. I mean, think about, they call math is white supremacy, for example, and we have to create a new mathematics that isn't white supremacy. Well, that just shows that these people don't know the history of math. Like, math, the math that we do now, I mean, contributions from China, from India, from the Greeks, then, during the Dark Ages, from after the Islamic conquests, in North Africa, the people that kept, all this knowledge alive until, again, Europe, took it on. And then in the modern era, like, is there anywhere that isn't producing global knowledge? This is not the province of one area or one people or one race, whatever a race is. This is a global effort, and we should see it that way, that we all belong to the human community, and that this is consequential knowledge that we believe that children should know. The other mistake that educators make is we can't teach people stuff that we don't know. So we can't teach about, the future, which is why I think that the whole thing about, we have to equip students so that they will do the jobs of the 21st and 22nd century. Well, I mean, we don't even know what the job market is going to look like in 5 years, let alone in a century.
Yeah.
When I went to school, who could have imagined where we'd be today? I mean, the most that we thought is, we would have a stationary, monitor by our home telephone plugged into the wall where we'd be able to see someone. I think that's as far as our thinking went. Mm-hmm. We never imagined we'd be carrying around a phone in our pocket that was more powerful than the most powerful computer at the time. So we can't do that, right? So let's not even try. And I'm not sure that schools' function should be just, filling up the labor market, right? Let's do what education is meant to do and give all kids, at 18, you have enough pertinent knowledge that you can be an independent adult that is responsible for your community and yourself. And now go forth and choose your path. And training for jobs or whatever is something you will do as you train for jobs. Or if you go to university, you'll go to university, or you'll get a job and you'll train there, or you'll do something else, or, but we have to make sure that the kids have broad-based knowledge of history and science, and that they know enough math that they can understand when they read something that has statistics in it. What is it saying? I mean, right now we're creating an illiterate society that easily, we'll watch a TikTok video and now I believe what I just saw in the TikTok video. Right now, if we had an educated society that understood things, well, maybe they would be able to think a little bit more critically about all the media that's hitting them, because they would have had a broader perspective than just their own life.
You've thought a lot about these things and you have pretty strong opinions around where education should be going. What's your experience? Because you're right in the epicenter, like OISE is probably the epicenter of a lot of these ideas and a lot of this thinking. But you're in there and you're doing this sort of alternate path in a way. What's that like? What are your conversations like with your peers, and what's that like?
Okay, well, it is true that I would say the majority of people at OISE would not agree with me and might even be hostile toward me. I've certainly experienced some of that.
Okay.
I find that some of the students, many of whom are teachers, will secretly agree with me. Okay. They'll talk to me afterward, or they want to talk further about this because there's something that I'm saying that has a ring of truth that, based on their experience, is making them feel as if, But you also have to remember that people are in different situations. I've already had a career. I'm not starting out in life where I need to pat the right back so that I get a job so that I can afford a roof over my head. I have a roof over my head. So I am in a privileged position in that sense. Mm-hmm. So I don't blame, some of the younger people that they agree with me, but they feel that they have to keep quiet in class, and that they'll just give the professors what they want, and they'll just write the papers that the professors want and keep their mouth shut and not say anything. So there is that. That does exist. Now, That said, there are a few people at OISE who are heterodox in their thinking. And certainly, I've managed to connect with those people and to learn from them, because they know all sorts of things that I didn't know and are experts in their areas. And those people are interested in research and science, mm-hmm. and interested in testing theories to see whether or not they're valid. Are the majority of people that are there, just touting a line? And sure. And, I've had many classes where the same articles are on the syllabus, or if they're not the same article, they might as well be the same article because they say the same thing. And they're just sort of, conclusions without anything backing them up. And they never consider anything else. I wish more people would speak up, but I also know that, you have to be a certain type of person to speak up. You have to have the confidence to do it. You have to be in, I talked about life situation. I think that's very important. I was a big mouth even when, I didn't have, some financial security. That was just my character. So I think part of it is just how you're wired. Mm-hmm. I recently, I bumped into, it was a music teacher that I knew back when I was 15 years old, and we were talking. She goes, "Oh, I'm glad to see that you're the same loudmouth that you were when you were 15." She goes, "You were not fearful." So I'm not fearful, but at the same time, I really do love people, and I don't care that people have different opinions. I really feel a strong connection to people and want to understand where they're coming from and what they know. And I really am an optimist in the sense that we can connect with people that we don't agree with.
Yeah.
I've been burnt a couple times because there is backstabbing and unfairness that goes on, but it doesn't dissuade me from continuing to ask questions. And I think sometimes that's the best way to approach it.
Yeah. I like your methodology, actually. I was hoping to get into that a little bit.
Yeah. I think it's very important, rather than giving speeches and saying, obviously here I've done that in this podcast, but I think it's really important to ask people questions, like to say, okay, well, and you mentioned operationalize. I will say that, like, someone in class will say, well, it's very important when I walk into a classroom and I use culturally relevant pedagogy. And I say, okay, well, I'm not a classroom teacher, although I do have some teaching experience, just not in the public system. So, like, break that down for me. Like, how do you know, let's say you walk into a grade 2 classroom. How do you know what everyone's race and ethnicity is?
Yeah.
Now, there's a question that at its base is challenging, right? Because this person's never thought about it, right? This person just assumes everyone with less melanin in their skin is disadvantaged, which is, I think, racist and a horrible assumption to make.
Yeah.
And that they're going to have certain beliefs, right? Like if they have less melanin in their skin, they're going to be anti-police. Well, ding, ding, ding. Like in one of my classes, I did a little activity with someone in the class who was Jamaican. And, and he, because of, he knew the kind of person I was, and he opened up and said, listen, I'm afraid to speak my mind. I'm an evangelical. I grew up in an upper middle class household. He goes, and I'm a police officer. So he said, I'm not going to fit their model. And I said, well, you should speak up if you feel comfortable, right? Because they're stereotyping you, and no one should be allowed to I mean, listen, cultures can stereotype themselves and have their own internal humor. That's fine. But we shouldn't walk around judging people and stereotyping them as if they're an avatar of their culture.
Yeah.
So, but when I asked this woman that question, her response to me is, well, you're an old white man.
Okay.
She didn't have an answer. And everyone rushed to her defense. Like they were worried about her. Then they start to worry about like, is Steven going to cause trouble because, I've externally labeled him or whatever, and my response was, how do you know how I identify? You don't know if I'm older, male, or white. And the professor had a hard time with that. Like she said, well, you present as male. I said, why do you ask people their pronouns in the class, right?
Yeah.
Because you accept that people may have a gender identity that doesn't fit perceptions.
So they're not even being consistent with their own
They're
ideology.
not being consistent, right? And then for the white thing, I said, well, I'm not white. Like I come from a certain ethnic background that was long oppressed by Europeans, and my coloring just happens to be my coloring. There's other people in my family who have darker coloring and whatever, and you know nothing about it. And I don't feel any affiliation with white people, and I don't see someone who comes from whatever their background, whether, German or Scandinavian or English or Irish or whatever, and say, oh, they're just like me. No, they're not part of my culture, but they're like me in the sense that they're a human being and that we live in Canada or whatever. Enough with the division.
But in asking that question, you basically start to get the gears going about like, how do we actually do this in a classroom?
Yeah.
Right?
And the fact was that nobody had an answer.
Yeah.
And, my concluding remark was, if no one can draw out the steps for me, like, are you going to ask the kids what race they are or what ethnicity they are? And then are you going to make assumptions based on that? Because I can tell you that someone may come from a certain culture, as you just described, right? That you may come from historically a Danish culture, but may have absolutely no affiliation to it whatsoever.
Yeah.
Know nothing about it, right? So you're going to make an assumption just because someone tells you that, their parent or their grandparent or great-grandparent came from wherever, that they have a connection to that place. You don't know that.
I mean, it had a little bit of Lutheran guilt, perhaps.
Okay. So, right. But, that when we talk about personalities or whatever, there's where we see differences, right? Mm-hmm. There's where we see individuality or whatever. But, I mean, we can't, what are we going to do with that? Like, we were going to have a class of 30 students and everyone's going to be taught differently. And because you have some Lutheran guilt, you get a different way of teaching than the next kid who's Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or whatever. Yeah. It's ludicrous. So, and to what end? And no one could answer that. So, my concluding remark was, well, this doesn't sound to me like it's operational. Mm-hmm. Like, how do you operate this in a classroom? And a typical Ontario classroom is, we're a multicultural country. Like, you're going to have kids from all different backgrounds and mixed backgrounds.
Yeah.
And mixed backgrounds where the parents may have decided to, front one culture over another or neither. Where the parents just said, oh, we're just going to be standard Canadians. And maybe not even Canadian, maybe just standard North Americans or just part of the laptop class or whatever. You don't know anything, and you shouldn't make assumptions about these children.
And it's maybe not even necessary, really, for the purposes of education.
I don't see it as necessary. So to me, this is, it took an American problem, right, which is unique to the history of the United States, and it imported it into Canada, and also, where the American narrative it was, because the United States has also changed and become a much more multicultural country. But the American narrative was white and black. Then they added in, Latino. So there was 3, but, that was kind of it, right? And then, Asia, and then it gets complicated because suddenly, it's broken down. When it was white and black, there was
coherent narrative or something.
A coherent narrative that was actually based on some facts. Like the fact is that the African Americans came to the United States involuntarily through slavery. And that lasted for a long time. And then there was systemic racism keeping them in their place, and an apartheid of sorts to keep them separate from the white population. Well, that's a very different history than what we had in Canada. Most of our Black Canadians are the result of people that voluntarily immigrated here once we adopted colorblind immigration policies in the 1960s. And they come from all over, and they come from different social classes.
Yeah.
And so it's a very different story. And so to adopt an American narrative and then say, I'm going to do that in a Canadian classroom where this person hasn't given 3 seconds of thought to either American history or Canadian history or to the reality of the countries that these people are coming from. That's the other thing. Like, okay, this child might come from Nigeria, but do you know anything about Nigeria? How many different tribes and kingdoms there are in Nigeria, and the different religions and the different languages? And right? Like, do you know that if that person's Igbo or that person's a Northern Muslim, or you don't know anything? Are they Christian? Like, and you're going to teach them differently. So if you have 2 Nigerians in the class and one's Igbo and
it also seems very hard for the teachers, right? Like you're actually asking a lot of the teachers in that context to do all these things, plus do the curriculum, plus mark the things and
absolutely
look after behavior in the classroom.
Absolutely. And you have to say, okay, we're going to load more onto teachers, and we're going to load this stuff like that. We can't even isolate what its purpose is. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So I think that, getting back to, how do you survive an environment where you do have a lot of people that are ideologically captured? And like I said, to them, it's almost become like a secular religion.
Okay.
Like to me, it's very similar when I talk to people who are religious. I myself am not, I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist, but I do belong to a religious cultural tradition that I'm not sure in my culture that we can separate easily religion and culture. But in meeting other people from different backgrounds, I also accept the fact that different people like have their own systems of belief. And for some people, that's very sacrosanct. Like for me, it's not. It's fine. You can ask me lots of questions about, my view of me in the universe. I do think that it's important for people to have a sense of purpose, and whether you get that through, your deeds or learning or a belief in God or worship or whatever. I think there's many ways to sort of cut that. But I think that people that do have a good moral code generally have some sort of system of belief that's more than just consumerism. But we have to respect that. So for example, when we talk about sex ed, okay, well, how do we square that with, I've got a community where I have Roman Catholics, and I've got Sunni Muslims, and then I've got secular people, and I've got gay people, and I have same-sex couples, and I have, right? The way to do that is not to demonize parts of the Canadian population. It's to figure out, okay, where can we agree? Like,
and so by demonize, like you would say, for example, if someone's Catholic and they don't really, or they're kind of not into the whole gender ideology, for example, then they would be sort of feeling like an outsider in a way in their own community
Sure. And they may actually have, and they do have common cause, let's say, for example, with, Muslims who are not secular, like cultural Muslims, about very strict gender roles or sex roles better, and about whether or not children should be taught about sexual acts at all, not just like at what point in time, right? But at all. But we can get to a point where we can all agree on certain things, for example, and that we can take off we can sort of lower the temperature by saying, okay, first of all, we don't have to call it sex education, right? So, what do we want kids to know? I think we can all agree that we want kids to understand anatomy. I don't think anyone's going to take issue with that. And along with that, that developmental anatomy, right? That people go through puberty, people become reproductive, that we can teach that. In health, we can teach about disease, airborne, fluid-borne, surface-borne, right? So we can teach about the various diseases and how they can spread and how we can avoid them. So we can talk about that. We can talk about different family systems, like if we're talking in social studies, that in different cultures, different family systems have originated in different ways, and we can cover them all, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you know, if you come from, certain Muslim countries, a man can marry 4 wives as long as he can equally provide for them. For example, we have, in Mormon culture also it was polygynous. But the standard has generally been a male and a female. In Western society, after the sexual revolution, we also accepted that same-sex couples could form family societies, but that, it's often very societally related. I mean, that might be a little bit more contentious.
Yeah.
But if we're not taking a moral stance on it and we're just talking about facts, maybe again, right? We're not.
Right. It seems like the main point nowadays is actually the moral stance.
That's right.
It's the moral kind of.
We want to morally virtue signal, and I think it's wrong because you as an individual have no right to tell other people how to think. We can put strictures around people's behavior so that in ways that make society function better. So therefore, for example, I think that that education is like, let that one go, right? Like, the fact of the matter is that children need boundaries. Like, when you speak to child psychologists or whatever, what's the, number one first thing they tell you in parenting classes? Children feel safe when they have boundaries that are strictly enforced and consistent, right? You give a consequence, carry it out immediately before the behavior that spurred it is forgotten about. Like all these things. Well, why are they not taking place in classrooms? Like, why are we not enforcing behavior and pro-social behavior? Like,
there's a lot of factors, right, that go into that. They're answering that question, which are like maybe they're too scared to get in trouble to discipline a child, or
right.
A lot of these things, right?
Sure.
The teachers aren't really getting supported very well.
No,
right?
But there again, like someone who has influence within education has to say children need boundaries, and boys in particular need boundaries, right? Because boys are often outwardly, and they don't necessarily mean to be aggressive, but particularly they go through a testosterone surge around age 5, age 6, right? Just as they're entering school, they need to know what the boundaries are very clearly, right? So that, we can channel their energies in good ways and not bad ways. And, instead of, worrying about starting academics in kindergarten, why don't we, take a page out of Japan and France's playbook and, teach kids how to clean their classroom together, how to prepare lunch or serve lunch or clean up after lunch, how to clean up the classroom at the end of the day, go through rituals so that, children start understanding initially, it's all going to be concrete. Like, I do this before I eat. I wash my hands. I clean the desk. This is where the fork and knife go, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end, I clean up and I throw this in the recycling and this in the garbage, and I clean the blackboard and whatever it is. But eventually they start to realize in doing those actions that there's a bigger purpose in that.
It's like creating order around them.
Creating some sense of order.
Yeah.
You want people to pay attention. What people that struggle with attention? What's the first remedy is you have to create order, right? You have to create consistent order, right? So that you can pay attention better. Yeah. Like the solutions are there,
and they're kind of simple in a way too.
And
right?
They're simple.
Yeah.
And we've gotten so far out of the smartest people in society should be going into education, right? We're talking about raising the next generation. Like they really are the future.
Yeah.
the smartest people and the people that want to get to the bottom of things, not the moralizers or the moral scolds or the people that want to impose their religious beliefs on others. It should be the people that want to better society as a whole, while also providing an avenue for people to self-actualize, right? So, like I always say, now in the news, the TDSB, because of their budget deficits, are going to cut music programs. And I mean, the music programs were terrible to begin with, but we could talk about what a good music program would look like. And then we can also talk about how many consultants and administrators are being paid, are part of the Sunshine Fund and being paid over $100,000 to, I don't know, like do more diversity or more inclusion, or, they have various offices, for this excellence and that excellence, and how much money is being wasted in the back
Yeah, like how much does it
rooms.
actually get to the students, right?
I mean, the first cuts should be to the back room, right? The last cuts should be to the front line. Whatever money is available needs to go to the front line. The back office is only there for the purpose to keep the front line going. I think they've got it backward.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot that could be done. I mean, even look at boards. Do boards need permanent offices? They can go to a WeWork office or whatever to have their meeting.
Just have a Zoom call.
Or have a Zoom call. Like they don't need, even if you're inviting in the public, like there are spaces that you can rent by the hour to do that, right? How much extra money will they have if they get rid of that? Or, the various offices and the various positions that they have nothing to do with the front line.
So right now, your take on education is quite a bit different from a lot of your peers. How do you see this kind of going forward? Like, are you hopeful that by slowly sort of plugging away at this, just by looking for evidence and asking questions and moving the dial on this stuff, do you think that's going to start to shift? Can you see any movement yet so far? Or
look, it's, and I always say you can't predict the future. Anyone who says that they can is, a fool. So I can't, but I'm inherently an optimistic person. I've given, numerous presentations, on various subjects related to this. And I do find, first of all, parents, there's a lot of nodding. Like this hits home, they get it.
The average person who's a parent or, whatever.
Yes.
And
they
understand the stuff
for
in a
sure
way better than the people who are educated.
Well, and sure, because, being educated can sometimes blind you to, and I know that from, my other area, some of my other areas of expertise, the fact I was a lawyer, that sometimes, lawyers are blinded to the needs of clients because they're thinking of everything in legal terms. Sometimes you might have a client come in seeking legal advice, but really what they want is an emotional closure, right? So an average person sitting and watching might notice that and the lawyer will not. So yes, I think there's something to that. So parents will see it. I also get a lot of nodding from teachers.
Okay. Yeah, that's right, because they're on the front lines.
They're on the front lines. And they're also, what I'm offering to them is to say, why are you going home and having to reinvent the curriculum? Like, why do you have to make lesson plans? Right? Like, you should have the lesson plan. The curriculum should be the lesson plan.
Yeah.
Like, why do you need a separate theoretical curriculum with this strand and that strand and it's 200 pages long? It's not doable. With fake conversations between, a teacher asking questions and like a student you've never met in this world who, has answers to them and then is referencing social justice and climate change and indigenous rights and treaties. And it's I've never met that kid. So forget that. Like the curriculum should be the lesson plan.
Yeah.
And here's what you're going to accomplish now. And then, the teacher is doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is not, drafting curriculum, but is to be the pedagogy expert, right? Who knows, who's
how
the
to get
expert.
someone from A to Z to B to...
How to make knowledge stick. That's what teaching is.
Yeah.
How do I transfer the knowledge that I have to someone who knows nothing? How do I make sure that knowledge sticks? How do I make sure that knowledge lasts? And then how do I make sure that that knowledge is available for future problem solving? That's the teacher's job. And you know what? teachers worry about their professionalism all the time, that people don't see them as professionals. Sometimes they feel like they have imposter syndrome, that they aren't really professionals in the same way doctors and lawyers are. Well, that's because they're not doing their profession. If they were doing their profession, they would feel like professionals. Yeah. And they'd be highly respected, right? Because when you wanted to make sure that you taught someone something in any realm, even outside of K-12 education, who would you go to? The expert who knows how to do it. Right? This is the road for teachers to be the professionals that they are meant to be. So teachers like this too. You know who doesn't like it is I've got lots of pushback from deans and faculties of education.
Okay. Some
of the, people who, what they're teaching is, critical theory of education in a faculty of education. Students who this has really sort of spoken to them, many of whom have figured out that this is the road for them to succeed in life, right?
You mean the critical theory road? Or yeah.
And that, they can fit themselves into one of the categories of oppression, and they can use that. They can use that to get ahead, to get jobs, to move ahead.
Sort of pragmatic choices.
Cynical.
Yeah, cynical,
right?
Yeah.
Like that they've lost sort of the program in terms of, you hope. And you can't say that everyone's going to be like this, but you want people to have, like, when I talked about a greater purpose, that's what I'm talking about. Like that you see yourself as like you occupy an important role in society. It's not just about you and your material acquisitions and your ability to get a job or whatever. Like you have to have a bigger purpose that is outside of yourself. But again, in a system where everything is self-referential, you're supposed to be like always self-reflecting and, journaling about your journey or whatever. It's all me, 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 me. It's very hard to get people to think about something beyond themselves.
So can the system change from within? I mean, you're inside there. You're doing it kind of from within.
I think oftentimes it's difficult, I think, from within because, people have an interest in first of all, people like inertia. People generally don't like change. For all the talk about transformational change, and we're going to dismantle society and change it or whatever, it's just words. It's just discourse. They don't actually mean it, right? These people want to keep their homes. They can talk about decolonizing all they want, but they're still going to speak English. They're still going to want the police to show up if someone is, breaking into their home. If they own a home, they're going to want that home protected. They're not planning on leaving it anywhere at any time soon. So they don't really want change. They just, they want a position where they're going to, have tenure and they're going to, be in that position until they decide to retire and have an easy life. So for sure.
So maybe not so much from the inside. Does that mean like a political solution?
Well, the problem with a political solution sometimes is that, when you have a pendulum swing one way, then the pendulum, politically swings the other way and smashes you in the face, right? Yeah. So I often worry about that. And, one of the things that I worry about and where education has gone to is that the result of it will be just, okay, well, let's get rid of it. Like, who needs it, right? Or let's completely privatize it. Or completely privatize it. Now, that said, whatever, I would entertain arguments about internal competition in the same way that, we have, a healthcare system that, is sort of one delivery method and it's through the government. There are many other countries that also have free healthcare where they have internal competition, where they have HMOs that are funded by the government. The patient never pays. But if you're getting bad treatment from your HMO and not good service, you on your next tax form, you tell the government you've moved HMOs to a better company and that HMO gets less money. And so there's ways to skin the cat, like, and I'm sorry for the animal advocates. That's a terrible, terrible metaphor. But
moves the needle.
Yeah, exactly. But there may be other ways to foster some type of competition. They do have that in the UK. I often look at the Michaela School, and anyone who's interested in education has probably heard of the Michaela School and its fantastic founder, running a school in kind of an industrial building and not a wealthy part of London and not selecting students. It's the students from the neighborhood or whatever, but they do allow competition so that she can run her school in the way that she sees fit. And the results are astonishing, right? So
because she follows a lot of the principles that you're talking about.
She follows all the principles.
Yeah.
All of them. And
what's her name again?
Catherine Bibblesang.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I can never remember that last name. But yeah, if anyone's interested in education, it's probably good to check out a YouTube video of her talking about her school, right?
Absolutely. And to read some of the articles about, how things operate. And there was an article that I read recently where someone visited the school and they were talking about some of the things that they saw in the school, like that a question was asked and all the children put their heads down on the desks and they had like a fist on their head, and that they saw that like one by one the children would raise fingers and whatever. And then at a certain point the teacher gave a command and then they all sat up. And as it turned out, the reason for it was that the teacher was asking them to think about something and that she wanted to see their thinking so that the fingers had meaning, but she didn't want anyone to be embarrassed. So the kids put their heads down so they can't see the thinking process of the other children.
Okay.
And the teacher only asked them to proceeded with the exercise when she knew that all the children now had the answer. Mm-hmm. So that she was going to wait and watch as, one finger indicated, okay, I understand the question you're asking me. The next finger was, okay, I'm working it out. Next finger, I've almost got the solution. Now I've got the solution, so that the teacher knew everyone's heads are up and they said it in unison.
Wow.
Right? So there you go. Wow. Now there's someone who has thought about every unintended consequence, right, of call out, because a lot of what cognitive science says is whole classroom work where the children are calling out, you're calling on children, cold calling. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be stationary. You can play mathematics baseball. You can have spelling bees that, you can get out of your seats. But also for someone to think about the fact that the fact is that some people are faster than the others when they come to thinking about that. And here is a technique that makes sure that you're only doing that when everyone is ready. And if the teacher saw that not everyone got the question, then the teacher would have moved to a different technique to make sure that the children who didn't get it learned, review, let's go back, let's learn how to do it. Mm-hmm. But think about all the information the teacher got from that simple exercise that looked so bizarre to the person walking into the class.
The way that your approach is, which is to look at the evidence, what's working, what's not working, that seems to be like a pretty good way to move forward, right? Because it's not political. It's like, okay, we're investing I think Ontario was like $34 billion or something roughly. We're spending all this money. Let's look at the results. Let's look at the data on how well it's working and how can we improve it. That doesn't have to be political at all, right?
Well, so here's the thing is that, you and I don't see it as political because we say, it's based on the evidence. For critical theorists, everything is political. Okay. So to them, evidence is political.
It's like a white supremacist concept or something.
That's right.
Okay.
So I'm not sure that we're ever going to... I'm not sure we're ever going to, get them to acknowledge that evidence actually is not political and that there is like a truth that actually exists out there, and that our role as humans is that we want to get closer and closer to that truth, and that, when that evidence and our findings are kind of like to approximate the truth, and then we leave room so that people make further discoveries so that we get even closer to the truth or realize that we're on the wrong path or whatever. They don't accept that. So they see that as political. So I think it's okay for us to say, this is political for you. For most human beings, this is not political.
Yeah, it's a bit more pragmatic.
It's pragmatic, right? But that's fine. If you want to see it, like I said, we can't change the way people think. So you want to see it as political, that's absolutely fine. It should be an election issue.
Okay, so then we're getting back to the political solution,
yes,
which is like, okay, let's put this on like a referendum or something, or
let's have parties, let's hold their feet to the fire And let's say education is very important. Education generally, the politicians don't care about it.
No, Ford certainly doesn't.
No. And let's hold their feet to the fire. And let's say the critical theorists, okay, well, you know what? You find a party that is going to front your way of doing education and you sell it to the public. Like in the public space, we live in a democracy. You seem to want democracy. I mean, maybe not this kind of democracy, but, put it to the public. Does the public want to dismantle society? Do they want to decolonize? Do they want, children to, have these complicated identities based on oppression? Put it to the public. I mean,
it's funny because like down in the States, they sort of did that, right? Like the Trump election was partially a culture war election.
Well, maybe at a school board level.
Maybe at a school board level, it is working. Yeah.
Right. But then, that also puts the onus on the people that do believe in cognitive science and some of whom, want to keep quiet and they want to keep out of the political fights or whatever to say, no, you should be fronting a candidate for school board elections. Like maybe let's bring it, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head. This idea just came to me right now. But to say we're going to front candidates who are cognitive learning science candidates who believe our education has gone in the wrong direction and they believe in evidence and science, and this is the kind of schools, elect me and then give out the challenge to the critical theorists. You run on the other platform and let's see what the public chooses. And then we have to agree that whatever the result is, that is going to be the result for the next 4 or 5 years.
Because education has come up a lot for my guests over the last year. One of the most, I think, disturbing things for a lot of my guests was the lack of transparency around these things. The way in which these sort of top-down ideological, forces in education were kind of pushing this down on people in when they didn't even really like it or want it. There was a kind of and no one really knew what was happening. Whereas, like if in your case, in your example, if we sort of made it more public and more something we could vote on, then it would be a bit more transparent. People would know what's going on in the schools.
Absolutely. I mean, the fact of the matter is that, the citizenry pays for the public education system. And generally, when you pay for something, that means that it's accountable to you. It should be accountable to you, particularly a public good like education, right? That the government should be clear. And I hate the word should because, you never get anywhere with should. But that's why we have to think clearly. Let's put our minds together and go, okay, how do we make it more accountable for the people that want change? Maybe we should be running people for school boards and getting parents more interested. It doesn't cost a lot of money to rent a room and ask parents. I mean, the schools or the school boards may not be, and I know this from personal experience, that there was a couple schools that wanted to bring me in because the parent committees do have funding that they can spend any way they want. And the fact is they can't spend it any way they want, that the school board wanted to know exactly what I was going to be speaking about. They asked for my slides.
Oh, wow.
I said, well, you're going to be I actually spoke with the principal. He goes, I need your slides. And I said, well, you're not going to find much on my slides except pictures. And he goes, that's weird. And I said, no, that's cognitive science. Like, I want you to listen to me. So there's no text on my slides. The fact of the matter is these parent committees are not allowed to bring in, speakers that they want. And in fact, the board said, well, we'll give you a speaker to speak about.
Oh, wow. That sounds,
No, it sounds dictatorial. But, people have that nature. People that like power. There's a reason why they like power, and whether they're so-called woke or they're Donald Trump, people that like power, and they'll exercise that power unless they're stopped. I always give the example. I go, it's not unique to humans. I mean, if you have a fungus or a mold or whatever, unless there's something to stop it, it'll continue spreading as far as it can go. I mean, the same with, plants. I mean, I do a little bit of gardening, and, you got to know where to put the boundary so that the plant doesn't, colonize everything else in the garden and take over.
Yeah.
So I think we should accept that about human beings, that is the way that human beings operate.
And maybe get more involved and be a bit more, knowledgeable about what's going on in your your kid's school or something
Well,
like that.
certainly, listen, parents have limited capacity, and particularly, and now I'm going to move it beyond what people generally conceive of, which is sort of the middle class, where you do have parents that do have some leisure time and extra time, and, they've been university educated, and so, they know what's going on. So, let's expand it further. I don't know if parents are the right ones to do it. I think it's the academics and the teachers who believe in cognitive science. They're the ones. Now I'm really enamored by my idea that they should run for school board elections and challenge the critical theorists to do the same and to ask the people which they'd prefer, and to go and have events where they educate whatever parents are able to come out, or, produce material for those that, are working, that they can read at home. And I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that the vast majority of parents want their children to be well educated, and they don't want them to be revolutionaries, and they're not looking for society to be overthrown. And it bothers them that their children don't read and don't seem to know math. And anyway, so, a lot of parents invest a lot of time, particularly the parents who have the resources and the time, in doing their kids' homework for them, in, doing their projects for them, advocating for them, going to the teacher, this was unfair, my kid should get this mark. They're busy orchestrating. Then they're also looking at the universities and colleges, and they're going through the courses, and they're deciding what their kids should take.
What a time suck.
And it's a time suck for parents. It's got to be stressful because, I can tell you as a parent that, when I got through the 18 years, I was like, okay, job well done, off on your own, obviously not financially independent yet, but, but at least off on your own in all other ways, so that, eventually within the next 5-6 years, you will be financially independent. I didn't want to see any university catalogs or whatever. It was like, that's not for me. And if your kid's not ready for university, then they shouldn't go to university. There's no point just going and spending lots of your parents' money, or going into debt yourself, even worse, when you don't even know the purpose of why you're there.
Yeah.
So, I think it would take a lot of pressure off parents if they realize that, really what education should be about is just making your kid a responsible adult, with enough knowledge to navigate the world. And then figure out what they want to do. They don't have to figure out what they want to do in grade 9. Take that careers thing out of grade 9 or 10, wherever it is.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy how it's gotten so much pressure.
Terrible.
Pressure around that, yeah.
Terrible. Yeah, I think that a lot of parents would. I think that they would vote for this.
Okay.
So if any of you cognitive learning scientists or cognitive load theorists, or people that believe in evidence-based education are listening to this podcast, and I hope you are, let's talk. Let's get people running for school boards.
Sounds good. And if people want to find out more about you and your work, is there someplace they can go?
I'm gonna. You know what? I think the best way. I mean, you can Google me.
Okay.
Some of my stuff is out. I actually have an article. For some reason, it's not showing up on Google Scholar yet, but was just published by the Journal of Controversial Ideas, because none of the Canadian educational journals or any journal dealing with literacy would publish it. But it was an article about basically how, even after the Ontario Human Rights Code Commission said that the ministry was failing children by the way they were teaching reading, and that they should focus less on sociocultural issues, so critical theory, and more on the science of learning, that the ministry, sort of cacked it up and didn't do it properly. So that should be, well, it's now publishable, so that's out. But I'm going to give you my email address, and I'll repeat it twice for those of you who have to go grab a pen or your phone. And please, I welcome getting in touch. I'd be happy to meet with anyone to talk further about education ideas. And if you disagree with everything that I've said today, I would love to meet with you and hear your challenges and have a great discussion. So my email address is S as in Sam, F as in fridge, REICH, SFREICH at sfreich@outlook.com. So again, that's SFREICH at outlook.com. I look forward to hearing from any of you. I do have some presence on X, although I don't get involved in political fights on X. So, I'll just advertise, things that I've written or presentations I've given, but you can certainly get in touch with me that way. I now just put in a LinkedIn profile, but I'm not a big social media user. I'm, Gen X. So I have a Facebook page for friends, but that's about it.
Steven Reich, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your research into education policy.
Well, thanks for having me, Sean. I appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Viewpoints. Thanks for listening. If you like viewpoint diversity and you want to hear more like this, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit viewpointspodcast.ca. And if you have ideas for topics or guests, we'd love to hear from you. You can connect using the contact form on the website, or you can send me an email directly at sean@viewpointspodcast.ca.